So now we get into the kind of meat of the discussion that this conference was set up to talk about and get to the bottom of today, if we can. We've got a great panel here today. We're going to talk, this is a panel about global injustice. How can we respond? What do we do about it? You don't need me to tell you right now that there are a lot of problems in the world right now. We know about the refugee crises, for example, which have dominated the news headlines in recent months, recent years. Almost 70 million people, according to the United Nations, are displaced from their homes around the world. 70 million. The UN says the number of refugees in the world today is higher now than it was in the immediate aftermath of World War II. Someone is displaced from their home every 2 seconds around the world, which is an astonishing statistic. It is a bad situation. And I think what I want to talk about today, and I want to get to the bottom of, is what do we do? But also, we hear a lot of kind of easy solutions. We should support refugees, but what does that mean? We should give aid, but how? Do we go out and try and fix other countries? Or do we mind our own business? Is there a sense of fatalism that says, the rest of the world is a dangerous place. Let's just mind our own business and deal with the problems at home. So I want to try and get to the bottom of that over the next hour with your help, with this excellent panel that we have here. We have Nicky Morgan, Conservative MP for Loughborough, former Education Secretary, former Minister for Women and Equalities in David Cameron's cabinet. She's currently chair of the influential Treasury Select Committee. We have, to my right, Jahangir Malik. I have to say OB because that's really fancy and cool, isn't it? Jahangir Malik, so OB, give him a round of applause. You got OB. Jahangir Malik is the CEO of Muslim Aid UK, former director of Islamic Relief UK, board member at the Association of Chief Executives of Voluntary Organisations and the Runnymede Trust. To my left, Afua Hirsch, writer, broadcaster, former barrister, author of the best-selling book British, which you haven't read, you need to read. You can see her on Sky News on The Pledge. She used to be a Sky News correspondent. She used to be a Guardian writer. And last but certainly not least, Dr. Myriam Francois, writer, broadcaster, academic, journalist. You'll have seen her on screen most recently on the BBC. She's also been on Channel 4, TRT World. She's written for The Guardian, The Independent, The Telegraph. She's a research associate at the School of Oriental and African Studies, SOAS. Give your panel a round of applause. So I'm going to open with a general question to you all. I'm going to ask you just to be brief, just so we can set the scene. What is the British responsibility, both governmental and public, to, number one, when it comes to foreign aid, and number two, when it comes to taking in refugees? Afua. And the microphone, I think you have to lean in a bit for these mics.
I'm always concerned by anything that decontextualizes Britain's role in the world from its history. And I can see the temptation with saying the past is the past. But the reality is that Britain historically has played a huge role in shaping our current geopolitical world order and also continues to play a role. So as a former international lawyer, for example, I'm very concerned by the fact that the rules-based world order, to the extent that one actually exists, well, to the extent that one has ever existed, to the extent that one still does exist, is repeatedly being undermined ever really since the war in Iraq. And if you look at something like Britain's role in Libya, which arguably massively overextended its legal mandate. What
happened in Libya? We never talk about Libya. It's a forgotten conflict.
It's very misleading to talk about our humanitarian obligations towards the refugee crisis in a way that detaches from our role in Libya and elsewhere in the Middle East. And I feel that there is this very disingenuous attempt sometimes to portray ourselves from distant from these global realities. I feel Brexit, and sorry to bring in the B word, but is a further attempt to
first of many,
remove ourselves and suggest that if we somehow close ourselves off, this whole problem will go away. And then at the same time, there is quite a dystopian vision in humanitarian relief that's popular at the moment. If you look at the rhetoric of someone like Boris Johnson, who suggested we should radically cut our spending on international aid, instead encouraging high net worth individuals and billionaires to contribute charity instead, while spending the money we used to spend on aid in Britain, as if that we are mutually exclusive to the world order in which we sit and which we've been shaping for centuries. So I think that it's very important to have more context and more honesty in this conversation. And I think if we had a higher quality debate in Britain, that would help to at least developing a more coherent policy here.
Nicky, do you agree with Afua?
I think it's really interesting that you started with both government, what government do, but also what the public feel, because I think that is something that's sometimes missing from the debate. I mean, what can government do and what can ministers do? Obviously, they can provide leadership, both domestically but internationally, money, And the UK is obviously one of the wealthiest countries in the world, so I think that's the least that we can do. We actually see that the British public are hugely personally generous when there is an appeal put out. I think that's been recognised in one of the world indexes. But there are also questions about the role of international aid. I do get, as a constituency member of Parliament, people asking me, why does the UK government, current policy, think that 0.7% of our GDP should be spent on international aid? What do we get out of it? Why is it that...
Are you a supporter of that target?
No, I'm not at all. And my argument back, and we'll probably explore this, is that actually if we want to solve many of the world's problems, then actually that international aid, building up countries, eventually economic development, has to be the right way to go. It's a matter, it's what we're debating today, it's a matter of international social justice. But I think that public view is important. I think that history, Afua is absolutely right. Of course, people want to say, well, let's look at the future, not the past. The difficulty, of course, listening to some of the first questions panel debate, is actually, should the UK or Britain be the last people to get involved, given what we've done in the past? Or is it our responsibility to be out there first? I'm not sure there's always a clear answer to that question.
To be fair to Owen, I mean, that he makes up in 1947 is 1947.
Yeah.
Libya is 2011.
Yep.
I believe you were in the cabinet
Yep.
at the time. No one talks about it now in British politics. It's a kind of, we talk about Syria, we talk a little bit about Iraq, occasionally Afghanistan. Libya is just airbrushed from the news agenda, even though it's the main transit point we know now for migrants coming in to Europe.
And I don't know why that is. I mean, we all know, of course, at the moment that not huge amounts gets any traction other than the B word, which would be nice to talk at least as little about as possible this afternoon, but inevitably that's going to be there. But the other thing is that I think the UK it's not just leadership, but providing expertise. When I went to Greece to see one of the refugee camps there, at the time when there was very high migration coming across from Turkey, one thing that was very apparent was that the Greek, for example, the social services system, in terms of foster care and the way they looked after young people, was very underdeveloped. That is a European country. That is something that the UK and others could easily provide expertise and leadership in, and that was not happening at that time.
And just before I go to Jahangir, just to clarify, did you say you don't support the 0.7% target?
No, I don't. Sorry, you said, do I support the view? And I said, I do
so
not
some of your
support
colleagues
that
some of your colleagues want to get rid of that target, right? You know that a lot of your parliamentary conservative.
I wouldn't say a lot, but I think there are definitely some, and I shouldn't think we shouldn't kid ourselves. There are a lot of members of the public who think that too. I think that view is wrong, and I think that actually it's absolutely right, and I think it's an honourable thing that David Cameron did in pushing that 0.7%.
Jahangir, do you want to pick up from there on this kind of... A lot of the public, including, I'm sure, even a lot of Muslims who want British governments to do more, and there is a sense of, but where does this money go? What does it do? What's the point of all this?
On the public, I take the John Barnes view, and that is, of course, the fact that the public are influenced by what they hear, what they see, and how loud those voices are. Now, international development is a proud component of our DNA, our makeup in Britain, and the 0.7% enshrined into law is a fascinating and a wonderful sort of symbolic act of where we place our responsibility vis-à-vis the past and the future. And the responsibility that we carry is that we say that 0.7% of our GDP is going to go into international development. Now, of course, as somebody in international development, there's a huge amount that needs to be done, and the needs are far greater than the kind of money and the output of generosity. I think the first thing to notice is that the British public, by and large, the most generous public, generosity in the British public is at a high level, well beyond many other countries around the globe, and that's all sectors of society. British Muslims play an active part in that contribution, and that's something we should all be very proud of. The issue is that the wars and conflicts around the globe are hugely complex and are hugely challenging. Aid, which we'll get onto, I assume, a little bit later on, is almost a last line of defense on these kind of situations. When everything else has fallen down, I mean, I've been into 35 countries around the globe, and I often stand in the middle of warring parties, conflict, disasters, displacements of hundreds and thousands of people. And the sad reality is the names change, the countries change, the vulnerable people who have been affected and the ones who pay the most heaviest price are the ones who have least to do with creating that situation. And then we here in Britain and elsewhere feel a sense of moral obligation, spiritual, religious, moral obligation to do our little bit, which reminds me of Mr. Javed's point here. Sometimes, even in aid work in the last 25 years, I feel like that beak, that bird that you were describing with the beak of water, because the fire is so raging, and it needs so much intervention that often aid workers just feel like that beak with that little bit of water.
So it needs intervention, doesn't always have the support, sometimes the support of Western publics or even the British public. Miriam, you've travelled the world as a student, as a journalist, as someone heritage in France, Britain, etc. How do you get the public in this country, for example, to care about what's happening abroad? People often put foreign policy in a different box from domestic. There's domestic policy, that's important, and foreign policy, that's the add-on. Because these are faraway conflicts in faraway places, and therefore it's of less interest and less importance. How do you change that narrative?
Well, they're in faraway places with very foreign people if you have no personal connection to those countries, which isn't the case, obviously, for everyone in Britain. And I think that's part of the divide that we see culturally within this country. And I personally think there's an inherent tension between nationalist politics, which is based on kind of what's best for the national interest, and obviously transnational politics based on what we might think is best for people elsewhere in the world and where we situate ourselves as a nation within that. And Afua touched on this, and I know we don't really want to talk about it, but Brexit has been part of a growing move towards a Little Britain mentality, a closing down, a recentering of Britain as meaning a very small island, of which the very nature of what it means to be British has become narrower over recent years, and we see that in debates over immigration. We saw it in the Windrush scandal. We've seen it most recently in the ideas that certain people can be stripped of their nationality, whereas others are clearly just inherently British. So, I mean, at that level, I think that it starts a lot further down the line. It starts in what kind of an education we want to provide people within our schools in terms of how we think of ourselves, where do we position ourselves as a nation vis-a-vis other people in the world. But I wanted to touch on one point specifically, which was when we talk about refugees, the term migrant crisis is often bandied about, and I think we should be quite careful about what we call the migrant crisis, because what we usually mean is the arrival of people onto European shores. The crisis is perceived as some kind of an invasion, and to that note, I think the real crisis is the number of people who are dying in crossings trying to make it to this nation, and the very few people that are out there actually able to try and provide aid to those people. So just to give you one example, I don't know if you've heard of the Aquarius boat, which was run by MSF, one of the larger charities. Aquarius was stripped of its flag at the end of last year, meaning that it was one of the last ships that was able to provide search and rescue to migrants that were crossing, many of them crossing from Libya. And so we've already seen in the small part of 2019 that we're in already a huge rise in the number of people dying in that crossing. Currently, Frontex, which is essentially like Europe's border guards, they have it is not their responsibility to rescue people. When you interview them and speak to them directly, they will tell you very upfront it's not their job to go out and rescue people that are drowning. If they encounter them, they will provide aid to them, because that's actually an obligation to them, but that's not their job to search the oceans for people that might be drowning. That was something that's been left to essentially aid organizations, to volunteers, to people who are actually just concerned about fellow human beings making that crossing. And now those people are fewer and fewer. That means there's less eyes on who's making that crossing, and therefore many more people than we already know are dying in that crossing. So when I'm saying we're talking about a migrant crisis, I think, Sajid Javid, for example, having to cancel his engagements at the end of last year because 220 people were trying to cross the channel. That's not a migration crisis. And so I think it's really important for us to question the terms that are used that reinforce this Little Britain mindset, where the real fear is people coming to try and come and take our resources over here. It's what led people in certain areas that were predominantly of immigrant backgrounds to still vote for Brexit, in my view, because we fostered a mentality within this society, and not just among white people, that there isn't enough resources to go around, and therefore you need to close down on yourselves and think about us before anyone else. And I personally, just as a person of faith, don't feel like that's a very positive development for us as human beings.
You mentioned the Windrush scandal. Afo, Jahangir mentioned British public deeply generous. Miriam made a point about education in schools, which you did as well, about kind of understanding our place and the role in our history. Something like the Windrush scandal happens, where actually you even had right-wing newspapers up in arms, and you had public across the board, wherever you are on the political spectrum, saying, this is crazy. Does that give you kind of faith that the public here, I don't know what word to use, is up for a better and bigger debate about our role in the world and our responsibilities and our comparison, or not? Be honest, you're not a politician. You don't have to say nice things about the voters.
What I'm going to say is probably quite controversial.
That's unlike you.
I think all reasonable people was completely horrified by the Windrush scandal. I think, I've been campaigning on the issue of British people being stripped of their nationality because they served short prison sentences for a number of years. And these are often people who had no previous criminal convictions, who maybe got in a fight in a pub and find themselves serving a prison sentence and then deported to a country they may have left at 6 months old, where they have no ties. That's been happening ever since the hostile environment was introduced. My view of the Windrush scandal is that many of the people involved in the Windrush scandal were perceived by the British public as good immigrants, and it was therefore quite easy to build a broad political consensus that this was wrong. Take someone like Shamima Begum, on the other hand, who I think the British public regard as a bad immigrant, so much so that the Telegraph said she never was British. So people are now actually rewriting her history to say that she was never entitled to Britishness, even as someone born in the UK. I think that is a better test of our attitude towards Britishness, and it's one we've resoundingly failed. And this idea that your Britishness is conditional on good behaviour, even if you're born here, that it's conditional on meeting the approval of public opinion. White British people do terrible things. People of immigrant heritage do terrible things. If you're British, you're British. And I think that for me, is a very alarming development. And the fact that this is something that is becoming socially acceptable, it's easy to see where this goes. So many of us, because of Britain's imperial history, do have either dual nationality or, like Shamima Begum's case, not even dual nationality, but some legal possibility that we could have it. So the idea that we could be stripped of our Britishness on that basis, I think, is really deeply disturbing. I just want to say one other thing as well. I think about, the aid situation. I really feel strongly that one of the things Britain did after the Second World War, together with America, during the Atlantic Charter, was create this system of international institutions. This was at a time when Britain still genuinely believed in itself as a great world power, and it had some good ideas. It had some good ideas about international institutions. What we're seeing now, which is quite hard to reconcile, is Britain kind of being nostalgic for a time when it was this great power, but yet unwilling to do the work of being a world power with all of the responsibilities that entails. Yet at the same time, many people in this country, what I wanted to say about that is that depoliticizing aid is absolutely crucial. If you look at what's happening in Venezuela at the moment, it's the best example of how politicizing aid causes more problems than it solves. This aid does not need to be coming from a very politically pointed effort from the American government. It needs to be coming from international institutions that have credibility with actually trying to help people. And I just want to finally finish by saying there are thousands, probably millions of British people who provide aid directly through remittances to their countries of heritage. That is the spirit of so many people in this country, and that is often overlooked when we talk about the generosity of the British public. The reality is we are living that.
So
we are providing that.
Let me put that point, and I'm ringing Jahangir. Let me put that point to you, Nikki. We've heard there were stories in January about Penny Mordaunt, Development Secretary, saying that we should put our aid much more in line with our national security objectives. Theresa May has said similar things, I think, last year when she came back from Africa or on her way to Africa, talking about aligning national security and international development. Do you recognise the point Afua makes about the dangers of that?
I do. I think she's right to talk about the depoliticisation of aid, and absolutely right to point to the example of Venezuela. But I think a government also has to both work or to understand public opinion, but not necessarily to be led by it. But in order to do that, you obviously got to challenge, but you've got to challenge in a way that takes people that explains to people why the government is making certain decisions. I think we have seen over not just the last few years, but over the last couple of decades, for example, in the debate about immigration, first of all, the government of the day not fronting up to what it was doing in terms of immigration, then saying to people, if you want to talk about immigration, you're a racist or you're xenophobic. So people then are driven underground, and then they appeal to more extreme political parties will appeal to them, and then we end up with an explosion, which is potentially what you can see around the 2016 vote. We need to learn from that, and actually, what I wanted to say on this panel, really, in terms of a global justice or injustice, is about education. I mean, we've all mentioned it, and it is really important, both in terms of, if we want to change understanding, then programmes that the UK government, but other governments are engaged on, in terms of educating children in this country, but working with schools abroad, but also just generally in terms of educating young people around the world. There are 260 million children who worldwide who are not in school. 75 million aged between 3 and 18 out of school in 35 crisis-affected countries. We are not going to change things unless we educate people properly, both here but also abroad.
So isn't it worrying that you paint that picture, the stats are scary, and Britain has a lot of good things to point to. And
Absolutely.
I'm sure I'm going to bring Jahangir to talk about that in a second. The British government has done a lot of good things, a lot of good aid projects under Labour governments, Conservative governments. DFID is a very admired department in the international sector when it comes to aid departments. And then you hear someone like Penny Mordaunt, your colleague, saying it's unsustainable, the £14 billion that the UK government spends on aid, 0.7%. Isn't that worrying when you say you're laying out the stats about what needs to be done and the good work that's being done, but that's all at risk if a Conservative government says this is unsustainable?
Well, I don't think
you're the Treasury Select Committee chair.
Yeah.
You know numbers. Is it unsustainable?
Well, no, of course it's not.
£14 billion in the grand scheme of things?
It's not unsustainable in terms of if a government sets this as a priority, which we have in terms of spending. Of course, we've got a comprehensive spending review coming up, which is when the UK government will decide its spending priorities for the next 4 to 5 years. But the 0.7% is enshrined in law. It's not optional for governments. That happened under a Conservative government with the broad support of the House of Commons, and I think it's one of the things that we should be proud of. But I think it's also right to say that, of course, a couple of Secretary of State ago was Andrew Mitchell, who first came in 2010, and he did say, let's look at where we're spending money. Are we spending it in the most effective way? And we have got to keep that under review, just not in international development, but in all government departments at all times. It's very easy to keep spending money because we've always done it, but actually making sure we're spending it in the most effective way, in the most areas. So that development of countries as they turn from needing aid to needing us to work with them on economic development, to potentially ending up in a trading relationship. That's got to be where we want it to go, but recognising it's going to take countries completely different amounts of time to get into anything like that sort of relationship.
Jahangir, how would you grade this government? Nikki makes the point that 0.7% happened on the Tories' watch. As someone who works closely with the government on aid issues, both at Islamic Relief, previously now Muslim Aid, how would you grade this government?
I think the international development track record of both governments has been, under the Labour government, DFID was created in 1997, and the first Secretary of State was from here, Birmingham, Clare Short, Right Honourable Clare Short. And so we've gone over 3 decades now of having a separate international development department that is highly admired by the international development community and is highly respected globally, stands supporting of the SDGs and the Sustainable Development Goals and all the rest of it. The concerning area is the language around the politicisation, the militarisation of this aid budget of the 0.7%. If it means to spend some of this budget in the Ministry of Defence, in other departments which outside of the core areas of supporting the international development budget, I'd rather that the 0.7% is decreased, in all honesty, because I want the aid budget to stay in its true form around the principles of impartiality. Just like I, as an aid worker, as an international development organisation, uphold the principles of impartiality, neutrality and independence, I want our aid budget to, as much as possible, to be aligned with the principles that we as aid organisations align ourselves to. So I think the government has had a good track record, and it's not easy territory for the Conservative Party. There are a lot of sceptics about international development, and under Andrew Mitchell, that we work closely with, Justin Greening, that we work closely with, and now a little bit of a trip up in the Priti Patel situation, but going forward in the...
You should be in the Foreign Office. You're like a master diplomat.
I know. We have to. It's the influence you have on me, Mahdi.
Yeah.
The Penny Mordaunt situation here. So we've got a good track record, okay, in both governments, and I think something to be proud of. We should defend it to the core, defend its principles to the core, not just the amount in itself, and ensure that both government and international organizations are upholding that, and be very, very careful about the slippery slope since 9/11 about the politicization of aid. Now, I've worked in Afghanistan, in Iraq, in Yemen, in so many different parts of the world, and it is, they call this in the international development space, the shrinkage of the humanitarian space. Well, it is very much a reality. Just in December, a bill was trying to be passed through about arresting people coming back. People like me, I've been into Syria so many times. Okay, I may have an OBE, but I'll still get picked up, okay, for potential terrorist and where I've been and what I've been doing and all the rest of it. So we're making it potentially more difficult for genuine aid work to be taking place and aid workers to be moving in and out of countries to be doing humanitarian aid. And I want to make sure that's protected and served in that best interest.
Miriam, I just want to pick up on something you said earlier about the nature of crisis. We talk about what's going on around the world, and again, come back to education and knowledge. People aren't aware, are they, that Turkey has 2 million refugees, that Lebanon, 1/5 or 1/4 of the population is refugee, that countries like Ethiopia have 1 million refugees living inside their borders. We talk about the 200 people or the 2,000 people or the 20,000 people, or even Germany's 1 million people, and we don't put that in the global context. That, for me, seems to be should be the starting point for any debate about moral responsibility for tackling global justice, the fact that all the poorest countries are having to deal with most of it.
I mean, although that does tie into a point I wanted to come back on, which Jahango was making, I think it's a little bizarre to me to talk about the depoliticization of aid, because aid's always been political and will always be political. There's no benevolence unless you buy into the idea that Western governments feel this very strong moral obligation towards other parts of the world, which obviously has been borne out by our history. No, it doesn't work that way. Aid has always had a political dimension to it. One of the earliest forms of foreign aid, if you want to think about the Marshall Plan, which was the US providing foreign aid to Europe after the Second World War, was very much tied to the idea that, sure, we'll help you rebuild Europe, just open up all of your markets so that we can flood it with Coke and McDonald's and all of our other products. And in exchange for boosting our economy, we will offer you a loan. Now, I mean, these things are always going to be political. I don't believe in the idea that there's any sort of benevolence behind that. I think it's built up on a perception of the white saviour complex, which is very current in contemporary conversations. The idea that we.
But let me just push back and say, okay, so let me just, for argument's sake, what's the alternative, though? You're not saying shut down Western aid organisations because they're hypocritical.
Shut down Western aid organisations?
Like aid departments.
I'm specifically thinking of, a few things. I'm thinking of the idea that we talk about sort of bringing countries out of poverty. Well, why don't we make clear to any companies that are working in the developing world that if you don't pay the workers in those countries a proper wage, you will be penalised. You cannot exploit Bengali women in factories to sell T-shirts for female empowerment in this country and then talk to us about foreign aid. I'm sorry, foreign aid starts with paying people a proper wage, and we can exercise some form of control or pressure in that regard. In fact, as consumers, we can start and exercise.
Can I just add as well that it's not just paying low wages, that what British companies evaded in paying tax on the African continent outstripped our international aid spending by 3 times.
Yeah.
A lot of that tax evasion was going into British overseas territories such as the Cayman Islands. So we've deliberately created a system where we benefit from not paying our due in countries in which we have a responsibility to function responsibly. And then we send in aid and expect to be patted on the back.
So a lot of people will hear that and they'll say that's a great stat that you just came up with there about they avoid more tax or don't pay as much tax more than the aid we give. The problem is, to come back to sorry to harp about, people don't know, right? People are just not aware of this stuff. You're teaching journalism this year. I didn't mention it in your bio.
I am.
So give her a round of applause. She's going to be... She's teaching journalism at the University of Southern California. Big gigs. Let me ask you this. Reporters, the future of news, important question. We know that media organizations from the BBC to CNN to Washington Post have already cut down on foreign bureaus, foreign reporters, the resources we need to understand the world out there. Do you see? Are you pessimistic? Are you optimistic that's going to change somehow? How are we going to know? How are we going to know about this stuff? What British companies are doing in certain African countries if there are no foreign correspondents on the ground?
I am concerned about the reduction in investment in foreign bureaus, but that for me is outshadowed by a much bigger problem in journalism. So I was the West Africa correspondent for The Guardian. I covered a number of humanitarian crises, food crises, famines, wars, and one thing that has been happening for a long time is that news organisations have not had the resources to independently fund journalists going into crisis areas. So who takes you? NGOs. So you will go, for example, to occupied northern Mali with Plan International or Save the Children. They pay for you to get there. They provide you with their own security. You follow them around. There is no official agreement that you will provide biased reporting. Of course, no journalist would agree to an arrangement like that. But when you're dependent on someone for your exit strategy from a war zone, it certainly affects the power balance in your relationship. And that is the reality, and it has been for years. And I'm personally very worried about, and of course NGOs, many of them do extremely important work. Many of them are motivated by the right things. But it's not healthy not to have any accountability by a completely independent press. And that is a reality that we're facing. So I think that is very disturbing. And just because I'm so glad Miriam raised the white saviour narrative issue, which has been in the news this week, but I retweeted an article I wrote 2 years ago, and people assumed I'd written it this week because nothing has changed.
Because no one clicks on links.
I made a documentary last year about the Biafra War, and the Biafra War, which was a catastrophic civil war in Nigeria, was really the beginning of the British press providing this international reporting role of a humanitarian crisis. It was the first time that photographers were able to go with correspondents, and pictures of these starving African babies were on the front page of all of the British newspapers. And the response from Britain was that people then decided to adopt Biafran babies. They were taking babies out of Biafra by the truckload to adopt them. It was kind of the perfect example of what, if you do not understand the context of a situation, and if you don't understand how to actually provide genuine development assistance, you get things completely wrong. And worse, the British press reported the disaster in Biafra as tribes fighting each other, these kind of senseless, barbaric Africans at war with each other. There was no mention of the fact that until 2 years earlier it had been a British colony.
That's how the Nigerian press is now reporting on Brexit.
Well, yeah, quite rightly. That Britain was providing arms to the government side, that Britain had substantial oil interests in the Biafra region, and that was a huge motivation in its policy towards the war. This was not mentioned, and so the British public thought and believed, because it's what they were being told by the media, that this was just these crazy Africans trying to starve their babies, and only kind British charity could rescue them. That is the power of the press and the danger of the press. And I would like to sit here as a journalist and say our attitude towards foreign reporting has radically changed since then, but I really cannot say that the change has been anywhere near as profound as it should have been.
I want to go to the audience before I do a couple of quick questions to Jahangir and Nikki. Just on a random tangent, given you run Muslim Aid, you used to run Islamic Relief. A lot of British Muslims in the audience here, I'm sure today, will be wondering, they'd love to get involved in some of these organizations. They do. There's volunteers, activists, employees. Others might say, I can't get involved. If I get involved, you mentioned coming back from Syria, I don't want to be called an extremist or a terrorist. A lot of these organizations get accused by the Daily Mail regularly of sending money to the wrong people. Sometimes they have. A lot of times they haven't. It's a false accusation. What do you say to those people when they express those concerns to you? What's your message? To be fair, the wrong people have changed quite a lot. That's true.
As well.
Depends on the day of the week.
Yeah.
I say that fully absorb the sentiments of this conference and find a metal inside themselves to find what we stand for in the social justice and the rights that we need to adhere to. It's a tough time. It's a very, very challenging time for us all. It's complex, it's challenging, and it's almost easy to become hopeless in a tsunami of wars, conflicts, crises around the globe, wherever we do. Every week there's something else. I'm Kashmiri heritage, right? This thing's been going on in my family heritage for 70 years. I spoke at Belfast conference a little while ago. I said, it's very nice. At least you guys got a Good Friday Agreement. We're still waiting for something from Kashmir in 1947. The reality is that the worst thing is to be bombarded with media and have a sense of hopelessness. That's not why we've come to a Hussein summit. Okay, it's not why we're here to be able to listen to great speeches about the lessons of the past. It's to be to instill and strengthen the resolve to be able to say, you know what, I'm going to do whatever I can, whatever that may be, and to ensure that we've had that resolve in whatever shape it.
And I want to give you, I don't know if the organizer will be upset with me for doing this, but I'm going to give you a free ad. You're the CEO of Muslim Aid. Tell the crowd today, what is the one conflict, disaster zone, war that they should be concerned about right now and doing something about?
I think what's happening in Yemen is a catastrophe, an absolute catastrophe, and it needs huge amount of political, diplomatic, and humanitarian intervention. So I think raise the voice, stand for justice, push those that are selling arms to stop this fueling the fire, as we were talking about earlier. Okay.
So,
and because I'm not going to give you a simple aid answer. I haven't been in this space for 25 years to say, you know what, give me some money. That's not a solution.
You're Jahangir Malik, not Bob Geldof.
Although I'd have to be careful of what language I use.
Of course you do.
I'm at an Islamic
Bob
conference.
had a slip-up.
I'm at an Islamic conference. We use nice words here. But the reality is, yes, aid is needed. Yes, we should protect it. Yes, we should support it. But, my God, we need to do so much more if we're going to...
So on that note, and we're running out of time, I do want to bring in the audience. Nikki, Afua mentioned the fascinating point about, we talk about aid to Africa, and yet what companies avoid paying in tax outweighs that. Let me take that and imply it somewhere else. The United Kingdom gives £500 million in humanitarian aid to Yemenis caught up in this conflict, £500 million. At the same time, they've sold £5 billion of weapons to the Saudi government, 10 times as much as they've given in aid. Surely that's an outrage that can't be defended.
Look, this is the same question that Owen basically
Slightly
had.
different. Worse in Yemen than in India,
Look,
Pakistan.
of course it's worse. Of course it's worse. It's worse everywhere. Nobody wants there to be conflict. Nobody wants there to be arms sold. Nobody wants there to be people who are reliant on the manufacture of killing machines in order to wipe people out. But there is a history of conflict around the world. Clearly, it's got more serious as the weapons have got bigger. I was saying to the gentleman down there who I'm sitting next to, I mean, I can't. It's a complex situation. The honest truth is we have a very strict arms control policy in this country. If I were a member of Parliament sitting here who was a constituent, who had a constituent business where a lot of people rely on these jobs, then of course other industry has to be brought in.
But Nikki, you know it's beyond arms sales. That's what I'm saying. India, Pakistan get arms sales. In Yemen, British military officers are helping Saudis drop bombs. That is part of the world's worst humanitarian crisis, in the words of the UN.
And that's a broader issue about the UK relationship with Saudi, which I can't pretend that I'm comfortable with. I wish that it were different. I have made protests when I was Education Secretary to the then Home Secretary about the fact that we were helping to train the Saudi police. That's probably why I'm not still in the Cabinet.
Okay. Interesting point to go to the audience on. Thank you, Nikki. Let's take questions in threes, no speeches.
Yemen is the site of a proxy war between Muslim countries, Muslim majority countries, and as much as we can call out Britain for selling weapons to one of them, I think there's also something to be said about us taking a very strong stance against those countries using this impoverished nation as a site for their own political ambitions in the region, which are frankly should be called out, because to focus only on Yemen as some kind of a crisis, famine, is to miss the much bigger picture that we have a responsibility, I feel, as Muslims to be calling out much more strongly.
Well said. Let's go, gentlemen in the red tie.
I'm Dr. Peter Rooks, and I worked in health service development in Papua New Guinea for 8 years, and researched health service development at the University of Birmingham. And I want to say that I think to provide aid to support the Sustainable Development Goals is not just a question of morality and justice, it's a question of economic common sense. Because why is it that people leave poor countries and move to countries that are more affluent? They do it because of their conflicts, oppression, the effects of climate change. Most people do not want to leave their own homes. So my question to you, is, do you believe that if we were to spend more money on supporting development within those countries, that we would see less migration? We'd be helping people to help themselves.
Okay, the young man there with his hand up.
Hi, I just wanted to put the point that Miriam made to Nikki about the kind of more subtle injustices that we see to do with our capitalist kind of extreme consumerism society. So you've got usually female factory workers in Bangladesh, making our clothes going into our fashion industry. There's the individual kind of thing you can do where, you can buy clothes from like charity shops and things like that, but there's also the legislation that the government can bring in. And, I just wanted you to pick up on that. Like, specifically, there are things you can do.
Okay.
What are you doing about them?
Lady there in orange. Yeah, that's you. Wait for the microphone to come to you right there on the left. Do you want to stand up?
There's this idea that one of the obstacles to providing aid is the fact that we stand to gain from inequality. So if we were to, for example, establish like an international minimum wage, that would affect our consumer standards. So first of all, do you agree that there's this mentality of keep them down so that we can stay up? And second of all, if there is, how do you combat that?
It's Miriam, or do you want to jump on that question since you were cited in that one? But do you want to jump on that one?
Yeah. So I think if we think of our resources on this planet as finite, then inherently there are limited resources, and the distribution of those resources can either be based on a principle that everyone is deserving to an approximately equal share of those resources and the wealth that can be derived from them, or the idea that actually, based on some sort of notion of supremacist self-belief, that some people are more entitled to wealth, health, and certain standards of living than other people. And in fact, to support an economy that's based on that, which capitalism is, right? Capitalism isn't built on the idea that everyone is going to benefit equally from our trade. It's based on the idea that, in fact, and particularly in its current form in advanced capitalism, that actually a small number of people will be deriving large amounts of wealth, whereas large amounts of people will have to remain in poverty to produce the wealth for that small minority. So I think that the system itself is deeply, deeply problematic, and I think what then sustains that are ideologies that are required to support that inequality. So you need ideologies to help us believe in the idea that some of us are more deserving than others, and the minute we buy into them, then we go, these borders have to be shut down, I don't support equal wages for these people because actually that means I'm going to have to pay more for my t-shirt in Topshop, or I'm going to have to pay more for my holiday abroad. So I think fundamentally it's about challenging the ideologies, because once you challenge them, then actually people could start thinking differently about how they relate to other people in the system.
Nikki, do you want to respond to Miriam and take on the young man's question about legislative steps that you could actually take?
Well, there are, of course. We can have far more transparency in the supply chain. So people have companies have to be far more open about who they're employing, how much they're paying, the conditions and everything else. And that goes so far. But I think at the heart of your question, and actually the lady over there, is this issue about changing public or consumer behaviour. I think the question was put earlier on, what can people in this room do? I mean, never ever underestimate, and I see that Liam is here and I know Owen's here, never underestimate going to see your Member of Parliament. Having a campaign locally, getting involved, whether it's at school, in the Send My Friend school campaign or whatever it might be. It sounds small, but the more letters that a Member of Parliament gets on Yemen or Syria or something else, transparency in the supply chain, actually it does mean that ministers get questions, departments have to answer them, and it does trigger a feeling that actually the public of this country care about that. But equally, lobbying companies. So you're right, there are some clothing companies that now have sustainable clothing lines. Actually, we could do more, can't we, by actually purchasing from them than from other people where the clothing is clearly made in conditions where people are not being paid properly. And we've seen that a little bit. I mean, you talked about hopelessness earlier on, and I had a similar conversation in relation to climate change recently, where I think a lot of members of the public feel very hopeless. Climate change is so enormous. Environmental problems so significant. What can we as individual members of the public do? But you saw with the David Attenborough programmes, for example, people beginning to think, actually there is something that I could do to stop using plastic, stop putting it in the oceans. Small steps make a big difference. But the trouble is, we've been talking about this for a very long time. Can I just challenge that, Miriam, something on capitalism? I think you were right to say we have a lot of work to do in this country on our capitalist model and how it's working and inequality, everything else. But there is a belief, perhaps mistaken, and I think there's more intervention now needed, that a rising tide lifts all boats. And I think we now know that actually perhaps it doesn't happen like that more intervention is needed. But it does go back to the gentleman's question here about the SDGs and economic development, and therefore, and I'd be interested to know the question, does more money lead to less migration? I would suspect not, because it's more about lifestyle, about safety, and it's not just about money, as I think we were hearing. But there is something about trying to enable everybody. I don't meet anybody in my constituency who says, I don't want people around the world to be paid properly or not to live in safety because that makes me feel better as a person living in the West. There might be a few, I'm not saying there aren't, but I think that by and large people are generous in their spirit, but they need to have the policies, they need to know their politicians are going to put in place policies to see that happen.
I think my point was just whether if we think of resources at a global level as being finite, that actually what you're saying, people saying, I don't believe anybody should be without, that's not the question. I think that's actually a relatively easy statement to make. The question is, what are you prepared to go without?
Yes,
what
absolutely.
are you prepared to sacrifice in order for other people to have? And I don't think a lot of people
and you hear that, and of course the immigration debate often heads in that direction.
But I think that also goes back, just very briefly, that also goes back to education, about making those links, about, we talked about journalism and everything else, explaining to people. I have the same debate, in the UK, just on UK policies, saying to people, they come to me, very simple. I think somebody talked earlier on about populism. They talked to me about very simple solutions. We're just going to do this. And I say, but hang on, the consequence of doing that is that this person loses out, and this doesn't happen in education and everything else. And when you unpick it, everything's more complex. But people are led to believe there are easy solutions to very complex problems. And that's probably where the political class has failed over the last couple of decades.
Jahangir, do you want
to believe that?
Do you want to do with this gentleman's question?
Yeah, we have this SDG slogan that the government has upheld.
Sustainable Development Goals.
Sustainable Development Goals about leave no child behind. So leave no child behind requires a huge amount of effort, but fundamentally it's not simply good money that will keep people and keep people in their respective homes. It needs to be underpinned by good governance, good security, good political systems. The Somalis and the Afghans, they've been going through this crisis over 20, 40 years now. I've been going to those countries for 2 to 4 decades. And what's completely shot is the governance frameworks in which that they're running. So we can put millions and billions of pounds into non-transparent systems which go into a few of the elite systems, and where the INGOs are probably right down, and so the Afghan NGOs or the Somali NGOs are even further down the food chain. So what's absolutely key and critical is we support a change in the business model of development itself, ensuring that we support local actors, local organizations, and organizations like us don't fly in to do aid work. We fly in to support, or we don't fly in, we support local civil society action and governance and accountability and framework.
But in answering the gentleman's question, can I summarize you saying it's necessary but not sufficient, the money to stop people?
It's necessary, but it's not money alone. It's supporting it in the right, absolute manner.
Afa, pick your choice of those 3 questions. What do you want to respond to?
To respond to the gentleman here on the SDGs, I broadly agree, but I do think we have to be very careful about this kind of self-interest motivation, because to take one example, if you look at Europe, and not just Britain, policy in terms of women's reproductive rights on the African continent, I speak as someone who has no hesitation about my unequivocal support for women's control over their own reproductive rights. But when you have European aid organisations saying they are funding contraception and abortion services so that it helps stem the flow of future migrants to Europe, that is beyond that is something that has been said by a number of European countries, that they need to make sure Africa controls its population because that is going to be a migration crisis for them in a generation. That is having the exact opposite effect, is radicalizing people on the African continent who perpetuate ideas that European aid is designed to commit some kind of genocide. And our policies and that kind of rhetoric is making it easier
we got time.
to perpetrate those groups. I just want to just quickly respond to the audience. Sorry, just quickly.
I said one of the 3.
Thank you for that question. And the reason why I like that question is that this is why it is important for us to understand history. It's not because we're obsessed with the past. It's because it created our present and informs our future. I think there are a lot of people in Britain who think the empire was some kind of benevolent Edwardian NGO that existed to help people by giving them railways and hospitals. The empire was primarily designed for extractive purposes. We have always invested in other countries so we can get stuff out for ourselves. That pattern continues. We need to understand it.
And those of you who are clapping, need to buy Afwa's book. Plug over. Quick, two more questions from the audience. If the questions are brief, or answers are brief, then we wrap up. Gentleman with the beard, there with the glasses, and someone from over here, yes. Another gentleman with a beard. Okay. No, it's both white men with beards, to be fair. You're trying to think it's all brown men with beards. You're the brown man with a beard. This is a very eclectic crowd. But I would like to take a female question. We'll take three, and they're going to be really quick. Can I have a lady with a question? I can't see where they are. Okay, wherever you are, I can't see you. Grab the microphone.
One here.
Okay, there. Go. Let's go. Three very quick questions. No speeches. Gentlemen, go.
A white man with a beard. Yeah, a problem. Huge. I'm grateful, Nikki, you brought in climate change. Climate catastrophe dwarfs all the other terrible problems that we face. Any community, any leader who truly confronts that with the appropriate level of consideration that's needed for each and every one of us to transform our lives, then we will be dealing with social justice at an appropriate and radical
Sorry to cut you off. Is there a question, or you just wanted to make that point?
I wanted to make that point.
Thank you. Gentleman here.
Assalamu alaikum. My question is, with the previous panel, we had mentioned several times about how we need to work through the United Nations, and a lot of aid work is done to the United Nations. Does the United Nations now have any credibility whatsoever in the world today, or does it need to be completely reformed?
Oh, that's going to have a short answer.
With no possibility of vetoes, etc.
Yeah, good question. Where's... Yes.
Bringing it back to the discussion about the conditionality of our citizenship and especially like the increasing awareness of that, I was just interested to hear what you thought about the media's role in sort of conflating Britishness with behaviour in terms of people of migrant backgrounds, or especially women of colour, especially.
Okay, let's go in the order we got this. So that was a comment. That was a question about the UN. Nikki, the UN.
Well, we
what was your take on your hot take on the UN?
A whole day's debate on the UN. I think look, I'm not an expert, but my hunch is that actually we don't hear nearly enough from the UN on any of these issues. And when I was doing the research for this and looking at education and everything else, lots of fine statements. I have no doubt that people who work in the UN are incredibly committed and want to do the best for the issue that they are facing. And I think Afua mentioned a rules-based system. I think the UN is a key part of that. Could it be reformed? I'm sure the answer is yes. Could it be brought up to date? I'm sure the answer is yes.
Not wanting to be a troublemaker, but Afua did also mention that the rules-based order took a turn in 2003 with the invasion of Iraq, which obviously your party supported. Would you accept that is part of the legacy of the Iraq War?
Well, I think probably that has to be right, because I think there are many conflicts, not just Iraq, but there are many situations around the world where we see UN resolutions passed and not much change.
Jahangir, do you want to say something about the UN in your space, in the humanitarian space?
The very fact that we've had 2 decades of war, conflicts, and everything else is a testimony of the role that the UN isn't playing at the moment. So it speaks for itself. UN's Security Council situation speaks for itself. Now, aid work and everything else, I think it's the system that's in place at this moment in time. We certainly work within it. But in terms of solving the big issues, I mean, it has to have, who can say it hasn't failed?
Okay. Afua and Miriam, do you want to pick up on Leigh's question about conditionality and migration? I mean, you mentioned it earlier on, but do you want to expand on that, and I'll bring in Miriam?
Yeah, can I just quickly on the UN say, I don't think the UN, I wouldn't, it's very difficult to defend the way the UN works. We don't have a better alternative.
If it didn't exist, you'd have to invent it.
I think that we need international institutions. The US has been at war for 3 out of every 4 years since the end of the Cold War. I don't think it's fair to blame international institutions for the fact that countries will aggressively pursue policies that are highly destructive in their own interests. We need to understand that for what it is. But I think that in the absence of international institutions, things would be worse. And also, the fact that people break the rules doesn't mean the rules are broken. The fact that we talk about it in the language of the rules-based order, even when we're condemning countries for violating that order, it's like if there are lots of murders, it doesn't mean that the law on murder doesn't work. It actually shows you that there is a law on murder and people are violating a law that we...
And do you want to say a brief point about that, because we're out of time?
Yeah, sorry. And about Britishness, thank you for that question. I mean, that's so close to my heart. I definitely think that there are some really problematic narratives about Britishness. And one, and the most extreme one right now, is that people who aren't deemed worthy of it are being stripped of it. As I said, I think that should be our first concern and priority. And anyone who is of Asian or African heritage, who is Jewish, anyone who has the potential for another nationality should be extremely concerned. And everyone in this country should be concerned that so many of us could be stripped of our nationality based on what a government perceives to be the public interest. I think that there are some other narratives that are more subtle, like, for example, gratitude. People often say to me, why isn't she more grateful? This idea that even though I'm British and I was born British, I should be very grateful for being allowed to be in the country and to have a platform. And I think that is insidious. That is this idea that if you look like me, you should be particularly grateful for having anything, and that being allowed access to institutions or being allowed to
be
publish.
fair, you kind of invite those comments by presenting a call-in show on LBC. So those are, yeah.
So why should I be more grateful for being on LBC than Nick Ferrari?
I meant yeah, exactly. But I meant that's the kind of, unfortunately, the question some of those callers offer is what I was making a point about. As I say, I'm not a politician. I don't have to praise people I don't like. Miriam, final word. Actually, I like Nick Ferrari, but I have a problem with the calling.
Really?
I do.
The way I feel about the UN is very similar to how I feel about the EU, which is I think that it's vitally important. It just needs profound reform, and I think starting with the idea that there's a stratification of members, as if some members are special and deserve greater power in making decisions about issues that have implications for everyone else in the world. So reform rather than some kind of eradication process, as I would also advise for the EU if we get a chance to speak up on that again in the future, hopefully. To come back to you, listen, so the British Empire was based on the notion of a stratification of British identity, right? Britain as the centre of the empire held a very special status, but that stratification of British identity hasn't dissolved after independence was granted to the former colonies. That stratification of who's British was simply re-centred within Britain itself, so that I feel we still very much have a two-tier notion of who is truly British, which comes up and becomes more acute at particular points. But one area that we saw it very particularly was when we had a discussion in this country. Well, not really, we didn't have a discussion. The government decided in a few particular group of people in Westminster decided what British values were for the rest of the country, and they decided what those values were in the context of Prevent, right? So it was in the context of the Prevent strategy in 2011 that British values were decided. And that was a very clear message, in my view, about who British values was being targeted at. We have a quote-unquote problematic community who do not understand what it means to be British. Let us in Westminster, by which it was predominantly white men in power, deciding for everyone else in the country what British values should stand for, but it was dictated as a form of admonishment against the community, and from my perspective, a form of collective punishment for the actions of a small minority that obviously the rest of us had nothing to do with, but still had to bear the brunt for.
And on that depressing but applause-worthy note, we will have to leave it there. Can we have a big round of applause for our panel? Nikki, Jahangir, Afua, Miriam. Whether you like it or not, I'm going to be back in a little bit to do this all again. With Owen Paterson, Liam Byrne, Salma Yaqub, we're going to be talking about very non-controversial issues like Brexit, austerity and immigration. So do join us for that panel, but I'm going to hand back to Sian right now.